In this video, we're going to learn about cloning, both plant cloning and animal cloning. The question, what is a clone? So that's the formation of identical offspring from one parent. It's also called asexual reproduction, and the offspring are genetically identical from the parent that they're being cloned from. This does occur naturally in many species through the process of budding, binary fission, vegetative reproduction or propagation, and fragmentation. So we'll take a look at each of those now. So our first example right here, this is an example of fragmentation. So starfish, if they lose one of their arms, they can regrow the missing arm. And if one of those arms breaks off and it has enough of the central ring, this inner part, that arm that came off will grow all the remaining missing arms. So now you have two starfish where you only had one before. This down here is vegetative propagation. So some plants send out what are known as runners, like a strawberry plant in this example. And that runner stays connected to the parent plant until the new section can set down roots and grow themselves. So that's an example of vegetative reproduction. This is a hydra. So what a hydra does when it's reproducing asexually is the parent plant will start creating this little bud, and the little bud grows and grows until it's big enough and developed enough that it can break off from the parent and live on its own. So these are little organisms that live in water. I kind of like them because they can somersault through the water. These tentacles can act as arms and move themselves around. And then the final one, this is an example of binary fission. So bacteria and lots of one-celled organisms, that's the way they reproduce. They literally divide themselves down the middle and split themselves into two. So plant clones, we can clone them naturally through natural propagation. That's when a portion of the plant breaks off and sets down new roots. Lots of plants can do this, and you can actually reproduce plants in this manner. So strawberries that put out runners, like I said before, you can sever that connection and then have a new strawberry plant. Spider plants do this too. They have little spider plant babies. So they have a little runner that comes across, and then a tiny little plantlet is there with little roots. Some plants you can actually cut off a leaf or a stem and stick it in soil or water, and then they will root themselves. So geraniums and bananas are examples of plants that can do that. So that's natural propagation because you're not doing it in a lab. You're naturally just cutting off a part of a plant and growing it into a new plant. Artificial propagation is when a single cell or a clusters of cells are removed from the parent plant and grown in a culture dish, and then you end up with a whole bunch of new little plants. So some plants are pretty good at doing this. So orchids, carrots, and ferns are capable of reproducing this way. But plants that are resistant to this type of cloning would be grasses and legumes. They would not do very well this way. This is a picture showing what's happening. So a scalpel has been used to scrape off a tissue sample. The samples are put on what are called agar growth medium. So basically these are plates, petri dishes that have basically the nutrients that the cells need to survive. And they have something called auxin. Auxin is a hormone that stimulates plant growth. So by having that in the petri dish, the cells will start to divide into tiny little plantlets. And as they get a little bit bigger, you can put them into soil or compost, and suddenly you have a whole bunch of little plants growing when you just took a few cells from the original parent. Animal clones are much more difficult, especially if you're talking about mammals, which is the example we'll look at. So the way you clone an animal is you take an egg cell and you remove the nucleus from the egg cell. Egg cells are haploid, which means they only have half the genetic information, because when we are developed, we get half of our genetic information from our mom and half from our dad, and then those two go together when the egg and sperm meet, and then you end up with you, who is genetically identical or genetically unique from your parents. So in animal clones, we're not doing that. We're not getting the genetic uniqueness. So we need to take the nucleus out of the egg. The egg is just going to be a receptacle. And then you can take the nucleus from the donor cell, the one that you want to make the new thing. So the egg then gets implanted into a recipient womb. It could be the parent that you're trying to clone, or it could be a totally different animal, same species. And then the offspring will be genetically identical to the donor of the nucleus. The example we're going to take a look at is a famous cloning experiment that took place in the 1990s, where Dolly the Sheep was cloned to make from a parent and became Dolly the Sheep. There is a bit of a sad ending, however. So what happened was there was a donor cell. So we had a sheep here where they took a cell from her udder and placed it into an enucleated egg cell. So they took the nucleus out of an egg cell from a different sheep, fused them together using an electric shock, and then the fused cell then began dividing normally and became an embryo. The embryo was placed into the uterus of a foster or surrogate mother. So she wasn't the donor of the egg cell. She wasn't the donor of the nucleus. She was just a third party. And she carried the embryo and developed the baby sheep. The baby was born, and we ended up with Dolly. The only problem with this, and problem with any type of cloning, if you take a cell from an adult sheep, those cells are older. So they're adult cells already, so they're already aged. So what happened with Dolly is when she was young, she was starting to show signs of old age. She had arthritis, so she had pain in her joints, things that you wouldn't see in a baby sheep or a young sheep. And unfortunately, Dolly did not survive for as long as a normal sheep would. So that's the story of Dolly the sheep.